The first time he saw her, she wore a yellow dress that held the sun in its folds. That was 62 years ago. Since then, Thomas Grady had fallen in love with her 1,000 different times, for 1,000 different reasons. But lately, he'd started to fear she'd never truly seen herself the way he had. She still had the habit of twisting her hair when she was lost in thought, still pressed her lips together before she laughed. Thomas sat in the breakfast nook that morning, the October sun reaching across the table. Margaret stood by the sink, drying a plate with the dish towel slung over her wrist. Her silver hair was pinned in that same soft knot she'd worn since their children were young. Her housecoat was faded, patterned with faint blue hydrangeas, and her hands, though they trembled now, moved with grace. She caught him staring and chuckled. "What are you looking at, Tommy?" "You," he said simply. "I just never get tired of looking at you." She rolled her eyes, but a blush climbed her cheek, blooming like it always had. That night, after she had gone to bed, and the house fell into the hush of ticking clocks, Thomas sat in the den with a sketch pad he had bought 2 weeks ago. It was untouched. A small set of charcoal pencils lay beside it. He'd never drawn before, not once in his 83 years. But the thought had started weeks ago. If I could show her how I see her, maybe she'd understand. The first sketch was awful, so was the second. The third looked like someone had sneezed on the page and tried to pass it off as a nose. But Thomas kept going, quietly and secretly. He watched online videos at the library, borrowed books on shading and human anatomy. He learned to squint, to break her into shapes and shadows. He practiced drawing hands on napkins in cafes, eyes on junk mail, and spent hours trying to get the curve of her smile just right. Sometimes she caught him staring. "You've been looking at me a lot lately," she teased one evening. "Can't help it," he said truthfully. She smirked. "What are you plotting, old man?" He only smiled. "You'll see." Winter came and she got sick. It was nothing serious, but it scared him all the same. Watching her sleep, pale and tired in the chair by the window, Thomas realized how much time he didn't have left. The idea of her never seeing what he saw, really saw, in her, it shook something loose in him. So he painted. Not just sketches. He bought cheap acrylics, canvas, brushes. He filled the small back room with attempts. Some clumsy, some hauntingly close, until finally one felt right. She wore time. Laughter lines, soft age, quiet strength. Her eyes looked past the painter, distant and thoughtful. Her hands were folded in her lap. Around her, the room faded into a blur of color. It wasn't perfect, but it was her. On her birthday, he led her by the hand to the back room. Her steps were slower, but when he uncovered the painting, she went utterly still. Silence stretched long between them. Then, in a voice barely more than a breath, "Is that how you see me?" He nodded. She touched the canvas with trembling fingers. "I never knew I looked like that." Thomas smiled, and his eyes shone. "You've always looked like that, Margaret. I just finally found a way to show you." She turned, her eyes wet. "You old fool," she whispered, and kissed him like they were still young and barefoot in the garden. That night, they sat in front of the painting together, hands intertwined like roots. They didn't speak, they just looked at each other, and in that quiet, Thomas Grady finally felt understood. The painting stayed in the back room for a week before Margaret asked to have it moved. "To the hallway," she said softly one morning, buttering toast with hands steadier than last week. "Where the light hits in the afternoon." Thomas blinked, pausing his coffee cup halfway to his lips. "You want it out in the open?" She glanced at him, amused. "You painted it, didn't you?" He chuckled. "Barely. Still surprises me every time I look at it." She looked down at her plate. "It doesn't surprise me." He didn't answer that, just sipped his coffee and watched her, memorizing her again. That afternoon they moved the painting together. Thomas had to hammer in a new nail, while Margaret stood behind him with a folded towel under one arm. They argued playfully over whether it should be an inch to the left. "Feels crooked." "It's not crooked." "Then the wall is crooked." "It's a 1920s house, Tommy. Everything's crooked." When it finally hung straight, or as straight as Margaret would allow, they stood back and looked at it in silence. Margaret's breath caught softly in her throat. "It's not just a picture," she said. Thomas looked at her. "No." She shook her head. "It's what you saved of me, what you see, not what time took." Later, while he made tea, she stood before it again, her reflection faint in the glass frame. She was thinner now, slower. But she was still in there, wasn't she? "Do you remember the blue house?" she asked suddenly. Thomas turned. "Of course, the one in Vermont." She nodded, smiling to herself. "With the crooked porch. We rented it for that summer when Sam broke his leg." He chuckled. "That boy ran straight into a canoe rack, trying to impress the neighbor girl. And you stayed up every night that week, sketching the lake." "I couldn't sleep. Your snoring kept the birds up too." She threw a cushion at him, laughing. But the sound drifted into quiet. "I never asked," she said after a while, "why you stopped drawing back then." He paused. "I never thought it was worth anything, until now." She looked at him, head tilted. "That's not true." He sighed. "All right, it's not. I stopped because I was scared I'd never be good enough to capture you." The weight of his words settled between them. Then she whispered, "But you already had." That night, Margaret asked him to sketch her again. "Just in pencil this time," she said, curling her legs under the blanket on the couch. Thomas fumbled for his sketchbook, hands slow but precise. The lines came easier than before, the shape of her more familiar in his fingers. But this time he didn't draw the perfect version. He drew the lines beneath her eyes, the small crease above her brow, and when he showed her, she touched the page and whispered, "That's me." It was the summer of 1961. Thomas was 20 and poor, fresh out of trade school and too proud to ask his father for anything. He spent his days working construction and his nights hauling boxes at a warehouse. He didn't have time for romance. He barely had time to eat. She arrived on the hottest day of July. Margaret Elizabeth Monroe, daughter of the man who owned the warehouse, and, rumor had it, home from college after punching a boy in the face during finals week. He didn't see her punch anyone, but he believed it. Something in the way she walked, her chin high, eyes always a little tired, like she was already 10 steps ahead of you. They first spoke by accident. Literally. He backed into her while hauling 2 heavy crates and knocked her clipboard to the floor. She bent, scooped it up, and eyed him with the scrutiny of someone who was used to getting apologies. Thomas just looked at her and said, "You shouldn't be standing behind corners. It's dangerous." Instead of snapping at him, she smirked. "Maybe you should watch where you're going, mule." He liked her instantly. They saw each other again the next day and the next. She started bringing 2 iced teas in the morning, wordlessly setting one beside him as he unpacked freight. He began calling her boss. She started calling him Muscles. At first, it wasn't flirting. It was more like a game they hadn't agreed on, but both refused to lose. One day she came in crying. Quiet, composed tears. He didn't ask what was wrong, just handed her a can of Coke and sat beside her on the loading dock in silence. She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes and said, "You're not dumb, you know." He blinked. "Okay?" "You act like you are, like you think no one expects better from you. So why bother?" He frowned. "And what should I do? Quote Shakespeare while I load sawdust?" "No," she said. "But maybe don't act like you're only arms. You've got eyes and thoughts." He looked at her, really looked, and something changed. 2 weeks later, he kissed her in the rain behind the warehouse, laughing as she scolded him for ruining her shoes. That was the beginning. Nearly 60 years later, Margaret sat in the hallway, looking up at the painting Thomas was asleep in the den, a book open on his chest. She traced the frame with one finger, lost in thought. Her face in the portrait looked peaceful, but there had been moments, even after marriage, even after children, when she hadn't felt that way at all. There were pages in her story she'd kept folded tight, out of fear of unraveling what they'd built. She didn't know why tonight felt different. Maybe it was the painting. Maybe it was the ache in her chest that hadn't quite gone away. She woke Thomas softly. He stirred. "Margie, what time is it?" "Late." He blinked. "Something wrong?" "No." She paused. "But I want to talk about something I've never told you." That woke him up properly. She sat beside him, took his hand, and in a voice that was quieter than the clock ticking in the hallway, she said, "Before we married, when we broke up for that stretch, I wasn't alone." He froze. She went on, not looking at him. "It was only a few months, but I thought you weren't coming back, that we were finished." Thomas exhaled. "We were finished for a while." "I know," she said, "but I always meant to tell you. But then time went on and it didn't feel important anymore. But it was because it changed me. It scared me how quickly I was ready to move on. And then, when you did come back," her voice wavered, "I felt like I'd betrayed a version of us, one that lived in my head." Thomas looked at her for a long time, and then quietly asked, "Did you love him?" She hesitated. "No, but he was kind, and I needed that." He nodded slowly. His eyes were wet, but his face soft. His mind went back to the time of their breakup. He was shattered, couldn't get himself to move on. He started drinking, working later and later. "Margaret," he said, "we were 23. Of course we were stupid." She laughed between the tears. "I just didn't want to leave this world with lies between us." He took her hand and kissed the back of it. "You never lied," he said. "You just edited." She leaned into his shoulder and finally, after all these years, felt the weight of it lift. Margaret was in the kitchen when the call came. She answered on the second ring, wiping flour from her fingers with a dish towel. "Mom!" The voice on the line was brittle. It took her a moment to recognize it. Claire. Her middle child. The one who always had everything together. She lived in a high-rise apartment, had a perfect posture, good job, and she had an efficiency about her that had once frightened the other children in kindergarten. Can I come home?" Claire asked. Margaret didn't ask why. "Yes," she said. "Of course." Later that night, the sound of Claire's suitcase, wheels scraping the gravel driveway, echoed under the stairs. Thomas stepped onto the porch, blinking into the night. She got out of the car slower than usual, her coat wrapped tightly, her eyes sunken but dry. "Hey, Dad." "Hey, Peanut," he said. "You're early." She managed a small smile. "I figured you'd still be up. You never sleep before midnight." He took the bag without asking. "You hungry?" "I could eat," she said, though she clearly hadn't eaten in days. At the table under the soft kitchen light, Claire slowly stirred her soup, her eyes moving between her parents. Margaret finally asked gently, "Did something happen?" Claire didn't answer at first. Then, finally she said, "Derek cheated." The words fell flat. As though she'd rehearsed them so many times, Thomas set down his spoon as Claire stared at the table. "I found the messages last week. He didn't deny it, said he felt like I'd already left the marriage emotionally, so he just acted on what was missing." Thomas inhaled through his nose. Margaret said nothing, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Claire added, with a bitter laugh, "It's funny, I didn't even cry. I just drove without packing anything but my laptop and a pair of jeans. Isn't that stupid?" "No." Margaret said softly. That's instinct. The next morning, Claire wandered the hallway and stopped in front of the painting. She hadn't seen it before. She stared at it for a long while, at the woman her mother had once been, still was. Then she noticed the sketch beneath it, tucked in a little frame. Her mother's real face, time-worn, raw, and beautiful in a different way. Claire felt something stir in her chest. Later that afternoon, she sat with her father on the porch. Leaves were beginning to fall in slow gold spirals. "You painted, Mom," she said. "I did. She looks loved." He nodded. "She is." Claire was quiet then. "Did you ever think about leaving?" Thomas looked at her. "Yes." She turned toward him in surprise. "Once," he said. "Maybe twice, but the thought was always smaller than the truth of her." Claire swallowed. "She said something to me last night," her father said. Margaret stepped outside with 2 mugs of tea and finished what he started saying. She said, "I feel like I betrayed a version of us that lived in my head." Claire stared at her. "That's how I feel." Margaret sat. "Then let's talk about that version. What was it?" Claire spoke to her parents as a woman trying to make sense of her own brokenness. They talked until the sky turned into dusk, and when Claire finally cried, she felt relief washing over her, because now she knew that love wasn't perfect. It was real, and real things sometimes break. He arrived unannounced, just like he always did. A beat-up sedan with out-of-state plates rolled into the driveway just after noon on the 3rd day of Claire's stay. Margaret spotted it through the window and froze. "Thomas," she said quietly. "Doug's here." Thomas looked up from his crossword. He didn't call. He never does. Doug stepped out wearing a wrinkled hoodie and aviators that didn't suit him. A 5-day stubble lined his jaw, and he carried a canvas messenger bag like a man constantly halfway out the door. Claire met him on the porch with a stunned look. "You?" He raised an eyebrow. "What? No hug for the prodigal?" She hugged him anyway, long and tight. Margaret came out next, wrapping her arms around him, as though afraid he might vanish if she didn't act fast enough. He tolerated it, but his eyes searched over her shoulder toward Thomas. The old man silently stood in the doorway. They didn't hug. That evening, the 4 of them sat around the kitchen table. The light was soft, the mood less so. "Claire's staying for a while," Margaret said gently. "Yeah, I figured," Doug said, stirring his tea. "You only come back here when something breaks." Claire's jaw tensed. "Nice. Just saying, it's not like we ever visited for the holidays." "That was your choice, Doug," Margaret said softly. Without answering, he just smiled that sharp, paper-thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. After everyone had gone to bed, Doug found Thomas in the den, thumbing through an old photo album. He leaned in the doorway. "You still looking for the good parts?" Thomas didn't look up. "I remember more than you think." Doug crossed the room, his hands in his pockets. "I remember too. You think I was too young to notice, but I saw everything." Thomas turned a page slowly. "Then tell me what you saw." Doug laughed, but there was no joy in it. "I saw Mom crying in the pantry after you slammed a door. I saw her flinch when you raised your voice. I saw you disappear into work for weeks and come home smelling like bourbon." Thomas's hand froze over a photo. "I saw Claire turning herself into a little adult just to keep the peace, and I saw me, invisible. The last one, the easy one, the one no one worried about." He sat down, the weight of it all folding into him. "I saw your love story all right, and I hated it." Thomas looked at his son and his face, lined and tired, but he didn't flinch. "You're right," he said quietly. "You're right about a lot of it. I was gone too much. I did drink too much. And Margaret, she kept things inside because she thought it would hold us together." "Then why does everyone act like you two are some epic, beautiful thing?" Doug snapped. You weren't kind, you just survived. Thomas nodded. We did, but you're wrong about one thing. Doug narrowed his eyes. I never stopped seeing you, Thomas said. I just didn't know how to show it, and that's on me. There was silence between them. Then Thomas did something Doug didn't expect. He opened the sketchbook, the one with all the drawings, not just of Margaret, but of the kids too. Young versions, laughing, crying. Running through fields, sitting on front, the steps, and at the back, one page that looked newer. Doug as he was now. Worn and closed off, but with eyes that looked exactly like Thomas's. I never stopped seeing you, Thomas said again. I just started learning how to say it too late. Doug stared at the page and for a long time and said nothing. The next morning, Margaret found Doug asleep in the den. The sketchbook still open on his lap. His hands curled around it like it might slip away. She didn't wake him, just pulled the blanket over his shoulders, kissed the top of his head and whispered, You were never invisible, baby. You were just waiting for us to grow up. The kitchen table had always been too small. It was perfect for 4 little hands and 2 tired adults back in the day. But now, with 3 grown children and the weight of years pressing in, it felt like a confessional booth. Everyone too close with nowhere to hide. It was Sunday morning Margaret had made cinnamon rolls. The smell softened the room, but the silence cut through the sweetness. Claire picked at hers. Doug leaned back, his arms crossed. Sam, the eldest, had arrived that morning, summoned by a vague text from Claire that simply said, You should come, it's time. He sat beside their father, watching everything with quiet calculation, like always. He was the peacekeeper, the diplomat, the one who had learned to love from a distance. Okay, he said finally, breaking the stillness. Who's going to start? Claire looked up. Start what? You know what, Sam said. This reckoning. Margaret flinched. Thomas didn't move. Doug scoffed. Wow, you sound just like Dad. Don't start with me, Doug. No, really, it's cute. That whole calm tone like you're the only grown-up in the room. Claire held up a hand. Enough. All of us need to stop pretending we lived in the same house and came out with the same scars. That silenced the room. She looked between her brothers. You think I had it easy? She asked Doug. I was 8 years old writing grocery lists and pretending I didn't hear Mom crying at the sink. And I was 6, Doug said, pretending I didn't care that no one noticed when I skipped dinner. Sam frowned. I was the one trying to hold it all together. You think that was easy? No one asked you to, Claire snapped. Thomas stood, his hands trembling, as they gripped the back of his chair. You're right, he said quietly, all of you. 3 heads turned toward him. You lived in our house, but you carried it differently, and I know there were years when we didn't show up like we should have. Margaret rose beside him, her voice shaking. We were so young when we became parents. We had no idea how to be anything but in love with each other, and sometimes that meant we forgot how to be what you needed. I used to think, Thomas continued, that love was enough, that staying was the victory, but that's not true. Staying with eyes open, that's the real work. He looked at each of them. His children, all grown, beautiful and hurting. I don't need forgiveness, he said. I just want truth between us before I go. The words settled like dust in the light, and then, for the first time in years, Claire reached across the table and took Doug's hand. Sam's eyes softened. We're not broken, he said. We're just unfinished. Margaret smiled. Tears caught in her lashes. We always were, she said. The painting stayed in the hallway, where the light hit it. In the afternoon, Claire returned to the city with less weight in her chest. She left behind a photo of her mother, tucked into her journal. Doug stayed a few extra days, helped fix the fence, and sat with Thomas in the mornings, just sipping coffee. I'd like to take a moment and pause. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Please show a kindness by clicking like and subscribe. It would help our channel so much. Let's continue our story. They didn't talk much. Sam called more often now. He sent flowers on Tuesdays, but never on holidays. And when Margaret passed quietly in her sleep, one crisp winter morning, Thomas sat beside her holding her hand and whispered, "I never stopped painting you." The children came home for the funeral. They stood in the hallway and stared at the painting. 3 sets of eyes, 3 different pasts. One woman captured in the light, and for the first time they all saw the same thing: real love.